most countries around the world, hazard communications is spreading. Compliance to government regulations is one thing, but safety of people is really the primary goal of hazard communications. Canada and the United States are setting the standard for chemical and hazardous material safety. Now there are many other countries which only a few years ago did not pay much attention to chemical safety, but are now developing similar programs. HazCom standards have been around for a while, and most organizations are diligent in their training and compliance programs. This program is designed to provide the most updated information about HazCom and perhaps identify some of the areas where more work needs to be accomplished. The term right to know explains the purpose of the Hazard Communications Program. This right to know information is about chemicals, how they can harm you, and what you should do to keep from experiencing injuries and illnesses related to chemicals and hazardous materials. It's an organizational responsibility, but as with every safety program, each person has an individual responsibility. Individual responsibility in following your organization's policies and procedures and thinking about safety on every task you perform. Certain chemicals, due to their physical properties, exhibit physical hazards, including flammability, reactivity, and other properties. Physical hazard chemicals fall in the following classes: flammable liquids or solids, combustible liquids, explosives, organic peroxide, oxidizers, pyrophoric materials. These are materials that may ignite spontaneously in air at temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Unstable materials, water-reactive materials. Health hazard chemicals are those that may cause acute or chronic health effects after exposure. It can be an obvious effect, such as immediate death from inhaling a deadly chemical. A health hazard may not necessarily cause immediate or obvious harm to you, or even make you sick. In fact, you may not see, feel, or smell the danger. An acute health effect usually occurs rapidly, following a brief exposure. A chronic health effect is long, continuous, and follows repeated long-term exposure. As an example of what kinds of chemicals cause health hazards, the list includes carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals. An example could be formaldehyde or benzene. Toxic agents could include lawn or garden insecticides. Irritants may include chemicals such as ammonia or bleach. Corrosives are caustic sodas or battery acid. That's not the entire list, but it provides an idea of different types and kinds of chemicals. If you're experienced, you should know quite a bit about MSDS or data sheets. MSDSs are factual information sheets that relate to chemicals. The manufacturer is required to provide the required information, and each employer is required to maintain these MSDS on file. Anyone who uses the chemical may then ask to see the MSDS to determine information that may not be provided on the labels. The employer may have all the MSDS information on an electronic database. The primary requirement is the MSDS must be readily accessible. If the company uses computers, a printer should be available to provide employees with a hard copy from which to read the information, particularly in a medical or emergency situation. Transmission of the MSDS information orally by telephone is not acceptable. To be realistic, the information on the MSDS is technical in nature, which may or may not be useful to users of the chemicals. Much of the MSDS information is used by engineers, safety managers, and others to determine the actual hazard of the chemical and develop policies and procedures for the safe use, handling, storing, and disposing of the chemical. The MSDS also provides information on what type of personal protective equipment is necessary and first aid procedures to take in case of exposure. When training employees in MSDS, it is not sufficient just to have them read the information on the MSDS. Training must be provided, and it must be delivered in the language spoken by the employee. Documentation of the employee understanding the training is also required. Some organizations have trade secrets, so they don't want too much chemical information exposed on MSDS. Even if a chemical is a claimed trade secret, the following minimum information is required on the MSDS: the PEL, or permissible exposure limit, and the TLV, or the threshold limit value, or other designated limits must be listed. Containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled in English. Generally, where there are non-English speaking personnel, the label should be in that language or languages also. Labels must contain the following information: identity of the hazardous chemical, appropriate hazard warnings, name and address of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. You may use signs, placards, symbols, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures in place of labels on individual containers, as long as the meaning is fully understood by the people using the chemicals. Where the chemical is intended only for the use of the employee making the chemical transfer, labels may not be required. This means the container must be used only by that person and must be used only during the work shift. If the container is to be used on another shift or by another person, then a label is required. Some common labeling terms include combustible, flammable, corrosive, irritating, and toxic. There are several systems and standards for labeling chemicals, but there is not a uniformly accepted system to date. Each system and standard has advantages and limitations. The ANSI, or American National Standards Institute, Z129.1, has a precautionary label containing the name of the chemical, a signal word, such as warning or danger, and the key hazard, such as flammable or vapor harmful. A statement of precautions to avoid the hazard is also included. NFPA 704 is another labeling system, which is a color-coded system. It uses a color-coded diamond with 4 quadrants, in which numbers are used in the upper 3 quadrants to signal the degree of emergency health hazard, which is blue, the fire hazard, which is red, and the reactivity hazard, color-coded yellow. The bottom quadrant is used to indicate water reactivity, radioactivity, biohazards, and other special hazards. The emergency hazards are based upon a numerical scale of 0 to 4, 0 having no unusual hazard, 1 equates to a minor hazard, 2 as moderate, 3 as severe hazard, and a 4 rating is an extreme hazard. The NFPA diamond is used primarily by emergency response personnel and does not adequately signal occupational hazards. The NFPA system is good for alerting personnel to the degree of hazard of the chemical and is helpful in drawing attention to storage needs and emergency equipment requirements. The DOT, or Department of Transportation labeling system, uses a color-coded diamond where there is a symbol and a term describing the major hazard of the material. The DOT system is used for the transportation of hazardous materials. HMIS, or Hazardous Materials Information System, is one of the most popular systems for labeling containers. It uses standard labels to communicate hazards through the use of colors, numbers, and letters of the alphabet and symbols. For as long as the HAZCOM standard has been in existence, there is still some doubt or misunderstanding of what training, documentation, and information is required for the Hazard Communications Program. First, employees must be trained at the time of your initial employment or assignment and whenever a new hazard is introduced into the workplace. Employees should be trained and made aware of what is required by the HAZCOM standard, such as labels, MSDS, the written program, potential hazards, and other general information. One thing that should be taught and fully understood by employees is that mixing chemicals without proper training and authorization is very hazardous. If you get the wrong mix of chemicals, you could be changing the physical or health characteristics. You could take 2 chemicals that, when used individually, are relatively safe. However, when you mix the 2 together, you could form a very dangerous or hazardous mixture. Don't mix chemicals unless you've been trained and authorized by your employer. Employees must be informed of any operations in the work area where hazardous chemicals are present. Employees must be informed of the location and availability of the company's written program. Employees must know the location and availability of the MSDS files. The training should include the observations methods used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. What we mean by observation methods is whether there are testing methods, air sampling, or other methods. How do you know if hazardous chemicals are present or if the air is safe to breathe? Employees must be trained in the physical and health hazards of chemicals. Employees exposed to health hazards must be apprised of both changes in body functions and the signs and symptoms that may occur to signal those changes. It is not necessary that the employer provide training on each specific chemical. Training may be conducted by categories of hazards, such as carcinogens, sensitizers, that is or may be encountered by the employee during the course of his or her duties. In the case of temporary employees, the host employer has the responsibility with a temporary agency. A frequently overlooked portion of the training provisions is dealing with emergency procedures. If a chemical were very hazardous, more information would be expected to be provided on the MSDS and emergency procedures. Training should include measures of protection, what action should employees take to control the emergency or not control the emergency, and related information. In situations where employees are expected to moderate or control the impact of the emergency, then additional emergency responder training would be required. In this case, an understanding of what hazardous substances are and the risk associated with them in an incident. An understanding of the potential outcomes associated with an emergency created when hazardous substances are present. Documentation of training is also of great importance. Here is a simple test to see if you're properly documenting training. Go back to training that was conducted 5 years ago and determine the following elements: name of the student, date of training. What specific information was taught? If it were a video or CD interactive, do you still have a copy of the program? If it were a stand-up lecture, the lesson plan should be available for review. Who was the instructor, and what were his or her qualifications to teach the course? Explain how you can tell if the students in this training fully understood what was taught. This can be in the form of written questions and answers or other similar means. This simple test will tell you if you are properly documenting your training. Shipping and receiving chemicals and hazardous materials may be the job of only the shippers and receivers, but it's important for all personnel who use or work with chemicals to understand the process. When receiving chemicals, proper paperwork, such as the bill of lading and other identifying information, must accompany the chemical. The chemical must be properly labeled. An MSDS must be provided for each chemical received. Without proper paperwork, documentation, labeling, and SDS, the chemical should not be received until such time as it is provided. The same basically applies to a person who uses the chemical. Is it properly labeled? Do you know where the SDS is located? Are you familiar with this chemical, and if not, where do you go for proper training and assistance? Receiving a chemical is more than just a warehouse receiver unloading it from a truck. Proper procedures apply to everyone. If you're shipping hazardous materials, you really must be properly trained. Let's ask a few questions and see if you know the answer. Can a hazardous material be shipped by the U.S. Postal Service? Can UPS or FedEx ship hazardous materials? How do you ship a can of flammable paint from California to New York? Where do you find the information that provides the guidelines for shipping hazardous materials? Well, how did you do on the quiz? The U.S. Postal Service does not allow hazardous materials to be transported. UPS and FedEx have special programs, but you have to contact them for the specific shipment rules. You can ship a can of flammable paint through an authorized trucking company that is allowed to transport hazardous materials. The rules for shipping hazardous materials is found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR 49, Part 100 to 185. What all this means is there are specific rules and standards for everything that relate to chemicals. You may not be a shipper or receiver of hazardous materials or chemicals, but the point is chemicals and hazardous materials require your attention. It requires you to read and follow the directions and information printed on the labels. It requires you to know and read the safety data sheet for each chemical you use. If you're not sure about something, be sure and ask your supervisor. Don't take chances when it comes to your health and safety. The HAZCOM written plan should have specific rules and procedures on personal protective equipment. The company must have an assessment of all hazards in the workplace. After the hazards have been identified or assessed, proper safeguards should be instituted to reduce these hazards. This protection can come in the form of engineering controls or personal protective equipment. Some chemicals may require the use of rubber gloves, safety glasses, face shields, goggles, rubber aprons, and special footwear or even respirators. Whenever the company requires personal protection, then it's up to the individual to wear it. When PPE is required, it's not a choice. It's mandatory to protect the health of the individual who may be exposed to potential health hazards. For persons who are required to wear personal protective equipment, such as respirators, then specific training must be provided. Personal protective equipment is an integral part of any safety program. Certainly it would be much better if all hazards could be eliminated through engineering controls, but that's not realistic. PPE is here to stay, and it takes everyone's effort to wear the proper equipment when it's required. Each day, new chemicals are added to the growing list of chemicals in use throughout the world. New, better, faster acting, more potent chemicals, better for greater living. The one thing we must do is keep up with knowledge and information. The Hazard Communication Standard is helping companies all over the world get greater control of chemical information and to develop methods and training programs to make sure chemicals don't become physical or health hazards. The program is working. More written plans are being developed. Better policies and procedures are entering the workplace, and employees are gaining greater knowledge about chemicals through effective training programs. It's a team effort, and it's worldwide. The Hazard Communication Program is spreading all over the world because there is nothing else more important than human life.